resources. Being Logical, A Guide to Good Thinking by D.Q. McInerney. When you click on that, it sends you to a download. And here's the, it's not even fair to call it a textbook. It's actually a very short and easy read. Being Logical by D.Q. McInerney. It's a full text downloadable PDF. This is the book for the course, okay? The lecture for today is going to cover both the preface and section 1. So when you get past the introduction here, I know I'm going really fast, you can see how section 1 is laid out. Preparing the mind for logic. This actually works as a useful outline for what we're going to talk about today. What it means to be attentive, how we get our facts straight, and what is a fact, ideas, the objects of ideas, and so forth. We're going to end our discussion with communication, how to be as clear as possible when we're talking to people, which is something helpful in your practice, obviously, and also about truth. What exactly is the truth, and is there something like a big T, truth? So that's what we're going to end today. Yes?
Sorry to distract.
It's all good.
When you went up to the person who asked you neurologist, would they be like asking examples and when you did, like, what was distraction?
Well, that was the great thing about the situation, is that he was up and into the aisle before I even had a chance to get the seatbelt off. So there was nothing I could do at that point.
So you
Plus, not only that, but for some reason, I think this is human nature, there was a crowd of just ordinary bystanders in the aisle blocking things. It was really annoying. It's like, what are you people doing? And just standing there gawking. I couldn't even get to the patient because people were just standing in the aisle, which was completely unhelpful. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if the question is, well, what should we do as chiropractors in a situation like that? There is a great answer for this. And when we get to our physical exam class, we'll have that conversation in detail. Yeah. Other questions?
Can I give a comment?
Yeah, of course.
I respond to emergencies. So if I went to an emergency where there was, when I was in LPN, when you walk up to an emergency where something's happening, somebody's dying or whatever, you just go up and you say, I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, whatever. You don't have to really talk about your potential, because if you're planning on working on it, that's the only reason it's in. But you don't have to say specifically what you are, because as long as you're saying that yes, it's okay or not.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, they're not going to ask for a curriculum vitae.
Yeah.
You know, it's really, do you know what you're doing or not? Yeah, that's a great question. What other questions do you guys have? All right. I do highly suggest that you guys go ahead and download this book and begin reading it. You're going to need to read this first section, part 1, as a review of what we talked about today. That way I know that you understand it. When we get back together next week, the expectation is that you will have already read part 2 as well, the basic principles of logic. Okay? Along with McInerney's book, you also have the chiropractic textbook by Ralph Stevenson.
Bless you.
Bless
You again.
And you have a book called Introduction to Philosophy by Nathan Smith, which is there as well. So all the books that you'll need for the course are available to you for free in Black. Just like last quarter, there is a writing assignment for this course. It's going to be based on Dr. Lon Morgan's article, Innate Intelligence, Its Origins, and Its Problems. We'll talk a little bit more about this as the quarter goes on, but I want to kind of give you a little bit of a preview of this. It'll be due at the end of the quarter. You can see the rubric there, and it's worth 15 total points. Okay? Like I said, we'll talk some more about that as we go along. But let's get into this for now. Preparing the mind for logic. Chiropractic is a science, philosophy, and art. So they say, and I think that's accurate. Logic is also a science and an art. It's a science insofar as there are rules that we can apply to good reasoning, to building arguments. There are rules. There's a structure. Otherwise, it would just be random and chaotic. And it's a science insofar as we relate the objects of our thinking, our ideas, to things in the real world. But it's an art insofar as we craft our arguments and our reasoning in a unique way that reflects our own form and style of thinking. So logic really is a science in its structure, and it's an art in its form, in the way that we put our ideas together and present them, our means of communication. Some of the course objectives here: identify differing epistemologies. Let's go ahead and define what the word means. Epistemology, we mentioned in the 5 branches of philosophy that we talked about last quarter. Epistemology is, that's right, it's the study of knowledge. What counts as knowledge, how we might acquire knowledge. And there are different forms of acquiring knowledge. Is science one way that we get knowledge? Of course. What about intuition? Does that count as knowledge? Yeah, it could be. Okay, what about religious faith and observance or meditation? Those help us acquire knowledge? Is that a very different epistemology than science? What about deductive reasoning? Like art, like the, well, which is not so common, right? But if we apply deductive reasoning, could we gain knowledge? Right? What about abductive reasoning, when we try to infer to the best solution given the evidence? Of course, all of these represent different ways that we could acquire knowledge. They count as different epistemologies. And we'll discuss these as to a large extent at the end of the quarter, when we look at different ways of knowing and how they apply to healthcare. And again, the thrust of this whole conversation is ways that doctors acquire knowledge and what we do with that knowledge. All right, so there's something like a medical epistemology. The patient who collapsed in the aisle in flight clearly had something wrong in that moment. Does this make sense? Okay, when I say wrong, I mean deviating from the normal and representing a clear threat to their health. How do I know what's going on? Well, as soon as I say the word know, I'm implying epistemology. My knowing of what's happening. Well, what do I need to do to get real knowledge? And what counts as knowledge? Does that make sense? The inspection of the patient counts as data, but doesn't count as knowledge. Well, wait a minute, Dr. Phill. It just sounds like you're being semantic. It sounds like you're just splitting hairs over details. Not really, okay? Telling me something about the patient, looking at their prior health record, against seeing the patient in person and engaging with them directly, are two very different forms of data. How do I reconcile those two different forms to know something true about this person? This is what doctors have to do. So epistemology is going to become very important to us as doctors as we study it going forward. We need to distinguish well-reasoned arguments from those that rely on logical fallacies. You guys see logical fallacies all the time, mostly in social media, especially these days, I would say. Given the kind of heightened tension politically that's plaguing us in this country, there are all manner of logical fallacies bandied about. It's going to behoove you to know these when you see them. That means you have to recognize good reasoning from bad reasoning, and to be able to cut through it so that you can argue effectively. Even recognizing it in yourself, because we are just as prone to bad reasoning as anyone else. When you see bad arguments for what they are, it prevents you from committing the same mistakes. And also helps you to reason more effectively against people who criticize you, right? But remember, argumentation is not about winning. It's about progress. It's about getting closer to the truth. That's going to be one of the underlying objectives of this course. How do we get to the truth? Okay? Not to put too fine a point on it, but if you find yourself in an argument with someone, a good faith argument, the hope is that both of you will walk away a little more enlightened, a little closer to the truth. It almost never happens. Because what we experience more commonly is quarreling, just our fighting with each other. Nobody wins in that situation either. So the hope is that you can engage in a good faith discussion with someone and through the process of good reasoning arrive at a higher synthesis of truth. Okay? Apply the basic elements of logic in the analysis of argument. It's exactly what I was describing. Develop cogent explanations based on peer-reviewed literature. We're going to have to get good at reading articles. You guys asked me how it was going with my writing. Well, it's going fairly well, thankfully. However, I'm also getting better at reading and writing peer-reviewed research. Okay? You're going to have to get good at that yourselves, because this is one key way that we develop knowledge in our profession. And as authors, it's a way that we contribute to the increase of knowledge in our profession. We need to interpret historic teaching and traditions in chiropractic through application of logical reasoning. One of the examples we're going to use in this class is Stevenson's 33 Principles. If you remember from last quarter, Stevenson's 33 Principles is a long deductive syllogism, which is a type of argument. We're going to use that as an example of study in this class to determine whether the argument works or not. And if it works, what does it say about us? And if it doesn't work, in what ways does it fail? Right? Sometimes figuring out ways that an argument fails is more valuable to us than figuring out how it works. Does that make sense? So we're going to use that as one of our key examples. Just like we talked about last quarter, these are our three major domains. Always, always think of this as a target that we're trying to hit in each of our philosophy classes. I want you guys to succeed in practice. That's obvious. When you get out into the world, a big part of what you're going to be doing is talking to the public. You're going to get up in front of the Kiwanis Club and other civic organizations. And you're going to stand there, the new chiropractor in town, you're going to say, hey, this is my argument as to why you should come and see me. Now, you're probably not going to say it in those words, but that's going to be the thrust of your message. Yeah? How are you going to make a good argument? How are you going to ensure that you're not falling into one of those logical fallacies and undermining your own pursuit? You have to reason effectively. Not only that, but with every patient in your office, you're making an argument as to why they should follow the care plan that you've laid out for them. Does this make sense? You come to me with an issue, I've assessed your situation, I'm offering you a solution, take it or leave it. Why should they take your advice? Well, how well can you make the argument? Does that make sense? Logic and reasoning apply in every situation in your practice. The national boards. The information for this class will show up not only in part 2, in the principal section, but effective reasoning will help you in every one of the national boards, including your practical exams. If you can think critically and reason through a problem, it helps you in every aspect of your life. Okay? And finally, research. When we're engaging in research, whether it's to write it or to read it, we have to assess the quality of it. And that requires the same critical thinking and appeal to logic and epistemology that we're talking about in this class. So, I'm trying to hit a target that overlaps all three. Okay? Just like we did last quarter, I'm going to try to hit that same target this quarter. What was the question that we engaged with last quarter in the Yeah, what is health? That's a metaphysical question. Health is kind of a slippery idea. There's lots of different definitions, lots of different ways of thinking about health. Is health some real thing that exists in the world concretely, or is it sort of an abstract concept? Well, we don't really know, and there are different ways that we can approach the issue, which is why we studied metaphysics. In this class, we're going to be studying logic and reasoning. It's over here, right? Down here at the bottom, this is physics, courage, ascesis, training, exercise, hardships and problems, scenes for practicing self-knowledge and mastery. This is where we were last quarter, in the first quarter class, physics and metaphysics. This quarter we are here, logic, temperance, prosuke, attention to the present moment, self-examination of impressions, desires, and actions, mindfulness. Logic, epistemology, and critical thinking will help you become more aware of the present moment, of the assumptions that you come to believe about yourself and the world, and provide you critical thinking tools to move through it and become a better person. Okay? So first quarter, it was all about physics. You can relate that to courage. How do you approach the world? What kinds of things are real and true in the world? This is what metaphysics is all about. This quarter is about logic. How do we critically reason and evaluate our own assumptions? Next quarter, when we get to ethics, it'll be about justice and oikiosis. Well, what is it all leading up to? Your fourth class will be arete, wisdom, virtue, pulling it all together. Okay? So if you're looking for a compass to kind of guide you, this is a great one. So here's our question for this class. Last quarter we talked about the question, what is health? This quarter we're going to be asking, how do we know? How do we know? Whatever answer you came to about the nature of health, that's great. But now you're going to really evaluate the strength of that answer. And you're going to ask yourself, how do I know that this is true? On what grounds is this true? Right? How do we know? Through the arguments and reasons that underlie the philosophy of chiropractic. What are those reasons? What are those arguments? Logic is the very backbone of a true education, and yet it is seldom taught as such in American schools. How many guys had a logic course prior to this one? Fantastic. Fantastic. 3 people. Okay. How do you know that you're not being fed a bunch of lies? How do you know that you're not just being fooled all the time by people? They told us about Plymouth Rock. History? Oh, a whole lie. There's a great book called Lies My Teacher Told Me about some of the misperceptions in history that oftentimes get promulgated in education in the U.S. How do you know you're not being fooled? Experience, right? Well, doing your own research is fine, so long as you can sort out what's good versus bad research. Well, how do you do that? Through reasoning, through logic, through epistemology. That's what this class is about. Okay. I think I'm making the case about as well as I can. Right? Epistemology is the study of knowledge. The nature of knowledge, what does it mean to say that someone knows or fails to know something? How do we know something? What are the qualifications? And then also the extent of knowledge. That is, how much do we or can we know? What are the limitations of our knowledge? We can't know everything. But the things that we can we know them completely? Can we be absolutely certain of what we know? More than that, how can we use our reason, our senses, or the testimony of others, and other resources to acquire knowledge? Are there limits to those as well, and to what we can know? That's epistemology. So in McInerney's book, he begins part 1 with preparing the mind for logic, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Being logical presupposes, that means it kind of assumes, our having a sensitivity to language and a knack for its effective use. What we're going to find in this lecture is that it's not just about thinking clearly, but about articulating our thoughts. If you can think clearly, that's great. That's great. It's important. You also have to be able to communicate what you think. Okay? You have to have a knack for the use of language. Not only that, if you cannot attach words to your perceptions, then you can't really truly claim them as knowledge. Does this make sense? The world as we understand it is constructed largely based on our use of language. If you experience something for which you have no words, can you claim to really know it, understand it? It's kind of tough, right? Now there's an other side to this sword. Sometimes we tend to box the world of our senses, of our perceptions, into our language and limits what we experience in the world. But that's for another time. It also presupposes our having a healthy respect for the firm factualness of the world in which we live. Logic is about reality. It's about the things that we experience directly. Finally, being logical presupposes a lively awareness of how the facts that our ideas relate to the facts that are the objects in the world, for logic is about truth. So we can really think about logic as truth and our relationship to reality as such. Now we need to be attentive. You've heard people say you got to pay attention. When I woke up this morning, true story, I went to the kitchen like I always do, and went to get some half and half out of the fridge because I made some coffee. And to my surprise, somebody in the night had left the refrigerator door open, so everything in the fridge was spoiled. All the meat, all the dairy, everything. You guys might like your coffee black, I don't know. I'm having to get used to it. Why did this happen? Well, somebody in the night did not pay attention, and now all of our food is spoiled. Okay? It's a very minor example, but it's also a very poignant one. Paying attention, the word to pay, literally means it has a cost. What is the cost of paying attention? I'm asking you honestly, this is not just rhetorical. What's the cost involved in paying attention? Awareness and
Misery.
time and energy. Exactly. Awareness, time, energy. It costs us something to pay attention, but it's a cost that we must pay. Because to fail to pay attention leads to catastrophe. It could be a minor situation like ruining some food in the fridge, but it could also end up as medical negligence and patients getting hurt. We have to pay attention. And when we reason effectively, we can only reason effectively by paying attention first to the facts. But that also then demands that we understand what facts are. We're going to get to that. Okay? What are facts? A fact is something made or done. It has a clear objective status. It is something we respond to as having an independent status all its own. It is naggingly persistent. It demands recognition and can be nasty if ignored. Let's look at some examples of facts. Okay? There are objective facts, which McInerney reduces to things and events. Okay, the pen here in my pocket, now that I hold in my hand, this is a fact, according to McInerney. Well, it's an object, sure, but the object is a fact. It simply is the case that I'm holding in my hand a pen. Okay? Now that might seem very straightforward, but it betrays a commitment that McInerney is making philosophically that we need to be mindful of. And that is something called naive realism. Naive because it's unquestioning, realism because it assumes something about the world. So let's dig into this just for a second before we go any further, because it's extremely important if you're going to go here with McInerney. You guys listening so far? Everybody okay? So here's what McInerney is assuming. And it's a huge assumption. And it's one that I frankly don't agree with. But then again, philosophers tend not to agree on this kind of thing. McInerney's assumption is this. Look in front of you. Seriously. At whatever's laying on the desk in front of you. Even if the desk is bare. McInerney is making the assumption that what you see in front of you is the case. That whatever objects that you see in your field of vision actually are there. And they represent facts in the world. And that the idea that you have, your sense perception about them, is true to the extent that they relate to the objects that you see in front of you. This is called naive realism. It means this. If you see a water bottle in front of you right now, Guy, it's because there is a water bottle there. Okay? That the perception that you have in your mind is accurate. That outside of your own mind, in a real world, there happens to actually be a water bottle. And your perception of it is accurate. That's all McInerney is assuming. And it's called naive realism. But Dr. Thornhill, you said you're going to agree with that. How come? I have my reasons. We'll talk a little bit about those. I don't want to stray too far from the topic, but it goes back to metaphysics, what we talked about last quarter. Are the perceptions of our mind completely accurate to the way the world is? Well, there's also radio waves in this room. If I had a radio here, I could tune in the dial, the receiver, and demonstrate through sound that there are, in fact, radio waves. Can I see them? No. Do I experience them at all? No. Unless I have a radio. Then and only then can I demonstrate their existence. Right? So my senses do not receive and reveal to me the fullness of the world. I only experience a very narrow band of reality. But that doesn't make that narrow band any less true. And this is the point of intersection. This is the common ground between McInerney and myself. McInerney would say, what you perceive through your senses is accurate of the world outside of your mind. I would say, yes, that's probably the case, but I would go further and say it doesn't represent all of reality. Okay. It's important that you guys know that, because we're talking about what he defines as a fact. He's going to say that if you see a tennis ball, there is a tennis ball there. Now, clearly, this is just a picture of a tennis ball, but you could say, well, there's at least a screen here, right? The screen is real. Yes, he would call that an objective fact. All right. Then what are subjective facts? Well, first of all, let's not get too ahead of ourselves. He also talks about events as facts. The desk in front of you is an object. It's an objective fact. It's a thing. This class that we are engaging in together is an event. He would call this a fact. Okay? But wait a minute, there are other classes that are happening right now in other parts of the campus. Are those also facts? Yes, they are. Can you experience them directly? Possibly. If you were to leave the room and go find some other class, then you could experience that directly. That would be a fact for you, right? But it's no less the case that those events are occurring simultaneously to this one. Well, what about previous events, things that have already occurred, like the most recent election or something like that? Well, how do we know that that occurred? Well, according to McInerney, you'd have to find historical evidence, and you would have to weigh the credibility of that evidence to determine its factualness. Well, we do this all the time. If someone were to make a claim to you, like D.D. Palmer adjusted Harvey Millard in 1895, and that was the very first chiropractic adjustment, you might be inclined to believe that on its face, but it would be prudent for you to then go and research the historical evidence and determine for yourself how true that statement actually is. And what McInerney is saying is, if the historical evidence supports it, then you are on good ground to say that that's a true statement, that a fact, it's an event that occurred. Does that make sense? So he's getting down to bedrock. He's trying to establish for us what counts as truth, what counts as fact, right? And according to him, objects in the world that you can experience, like a pen or a tennis ball or the table in front of you, those are facts. But he's also saying that events are facts, even events that have occurred, so long as they can be supported credibly by historical evidence. Okay?
So that whole argument about seeing something right here, that makes sense. I can understand that part.
Yeah.
But the whole historical aspect of it, how could you say that something in history is a fact based off of the fighting and reading certain articles?
Well, this is where he and I would begin to disagree. Okay? I mentioned earlier the book Lies My Teacher Told Me, and you mentioned Plymouth Rock, and this is a great example. Did the events occur the way that they're presented? Well, there's always some interpretation. There's always a high degree of subjectivity. However, there is something that actually is the case about the event, right? Apart from our misperceptions, apart from the misrepresentation of the events, there is some actual event that took place that is the case. And the closer we can come to that, the closer we come to truth from McInerney. Okay? So our misunderstanding of the event does not take away from the truth, the big T truth of what actually happened. Okay?
But when you argue like a farther away you get from the truth, the more work you'll get until eventually you don't have anything actually close to the source.
Of course, and he makes the same argument as well in the book, and that's his justification for studying logic and reason and epistemology. He's going to say by the effective use of logic and epistemology, you can cut through some of the ambiguity and vagueness, and you can get closer and closer to the truth. So your intuitions about it are right on. Perfect. Yes?
That example you gave at the beginning when there was a patient on the airplane, that was the thing that was happening.
Yes. The patient himself was an object. I hate to reduce somebody to object, but McInerney would say there's a dual truth. There are two facts involved here. There is a fact that there is a person on the floor, according to McInerney. But the event itself, of being on a plane with a person in distress, that's also a fact, according to McInerney. So you're absolutely right. It satisfies both qualifications of a fact, according to his reasoning. Okay? That's a great way of thinking about it. There are also subjective facts. We just finished talking about objective facts. What are the two types of objective facts? things and events. A subjective fact is something that is experienced in the mind of another person. Patient presents with headache. Okay? Is that a fact? Technically, yeah, according to McInerney, but it's not something that I can experience directly. It's not like the pen. I can't see their headache. Okay? I can't assess it directly, objectively. I'm relying on the testimony of the individual and the truthfulness of their report. Does this make sense? Right? They can experience the headache. It's very real for them. Pain in any part of the body is this way. But it's a subjective fact. Okay? That has obvious importance to us as doctors. If a patient says, hey doc, I'm having some pain in my lower back. It's a typical Tuesday in a chiropractic office. Regardless of how you feel about whether chiropractors are treating low back pain, it is the case that people show up with this presentation all the time. Does that constitute a fact? Well, yeah, according to McInerney, because the patient's really experiencing it. Now it's incumbent upon us to figure out the nature of that fact, that pain, and try to figure out what to do about it. Yeah.
Well, I think that subjective experience of like pain, right? Nobody experiences pain on the same level for the same things. Like people will have really high pain tolerance, and like something that would put somebody else on their knees just like they're never seen that.
Sure, and that creates a kind of problem for us because no two people experience pain the same way. And we have to kind of take it at face value.
How do you measure that?
Well, we can use instruments like a global pain scale, and there are other subjective instruments that we can use in our practice to assess pain. But we can't get inside another person's head to know exactly what it's like to be them in that situation. We have to sort of halt at that point and say we have to rely on their testimony. It's tough, yes.
So when you talk about the perspective of McInerney, is that from the realist perspective?
Yeah, it's still a realist perspective.
And so when the realist comes across a subjective fact like the patient has a headache, well, that's not in the realm of perception, so then that's not a fact of false.
It's a fact for the person experiencing the pain, but it's not some object that I can measure directly.
And that wouldn't be a fact of the realist.
No, it wouldn't. It's still real ontologically in the world. It still represents some real phenomenon. It's just not something that I have access to firsthand.
And I thought that the premise for realist facts was having something that they personally could perceive.
The realist would really talk about realism versus something that was supernatural, let's say. Okay, if it's real, then it exists in such a way that it can be accessed at least by somebody, by someone's mind, right? If the patient's experiencing pain, then that's a real perception for that person that they can then report on. That's all that McInerney is saying. Now, it could also be a lie. Somebody could fabricate their symptoms and be completely dishonest about it. But that doesn't count as knowledge. And this is where epistemology comes in, right? If the patient's being truthful and they are experiencing this pain, then there is some epistemic truth to it. What it means is they're being honest about it. And we have some justification, right? Some way to assess it clinically. If a patient's lying about it, a lie doesn't count as knowledge. And this is where our application of reason comes in. It's essential in this case. Does that make sense? These are great questions, you guys. How you doing?
I have one more question.
Yes.
Is it time for break?
It is time for break. So, go ahead and take about 10 minutes. We'll get started at about 12 after.
No, just now.
Even though he does it like 35. I've never really been surprised. Except for the
Not surprised if that is the case.
I don't think it's a lot. The Rockies don't have but he's also all you can do is yeah. I was gonna break it down to the ass and say I was gonna bring it for you,
Okay, see you in a bit.
Your paper machine going on?
Huh?
Your paper machine?
Okay, get to it. Coming to the gym?
Yes, I miss you. I'm going to really change up my schedule this semester. Weird class schedule.
Yeah. I think as of now, we're going to start doing Mondays, Tuesdays after class, and then I'm probably going to do Thursday.
No, we're not going to do stuff like cardio, days that I get at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. and then weight training. Jeans.
I saw that earlier, like, cheese? No cardio.
Oh, come on. Cardio.
I used to run cross country and that. I switched out my endurance. This is my first fast switch, and so running in a
I'm thinking about doing this.
Oh, it didn't know that.
It's wonderful.
Where's it at? Is it
Right next to Veterans. I need to write as we very unique to see the other.
say walking?
That made me so grateful for I don't have common straight, but I no, yeah. Yeah, no. Who's already great.
Like I almost got this serious.
I know, this is not.
I'm not a like an athletic swimmer, I guess.
Can I get it on video? Yeah.
No, that should look so much better.
That's crazy, right?
Fuck right now. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I'm so down.
Okay, so I'm actually
Oh, and then you went to a game? Oh my god, what did you play? Nobody.
It was legit. The game ended up being 2-1.
Yeah. He's just there for money, you know? I know, she'll be back tomorrow. Where's home? Oh, okay, yes. I didn't want to do that in 40 miles. I've never been to Columbus, but we're kind of close to like Eufaula where the waterfalls are. Actually, that's why I have been to Columbus because the state championship for cheerleading is in Columbus. So I've been there. Yeah. Yes, I want to I've never been to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Georgia.
No, Ohio. Yeah. I know, that's why I was like confused. No.
No. I'm already strange.
So, you're wrong for that. There's nothing. I know it's like the worst part of the state. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't.
Okay.
I would feel more safe.
Well, I meant in terms of like, okay, let me rephrase. It is ranked as the most poor part of the state. Would you agree with that?
I would not disagree.
Okay. I was just wondering if like because like I've never been like out in there, you know, so I didn't know like what. Yeah. Yes. Yes, they're everywhere. I think it's I don't know what this ranking is based on. It would probably just be like median income. Yeah.
It's definitely
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, to me, I would like put like all the equipment, Thomasville. Sorry. Oh, like near.
But no, I saw it's a good place to be.
Oh yeah, that is where they have the basic and stuff. Yeah.
Like if you are in the army,
Yeah. Yes. Wait, what was it? Yes. Yes.
let's say Confederates, general.
Yeah.
Bro, who got you?
I don't know his name.
What's one place?
All right, guys. And we're back.
I'll talk your ear off.
We're talking about facts. We're talking about facts. The question that we ended on before the break was about realism. And this very last point of the slide, establishing the reality of subjective facts depends entirely on the trustworthiness of those who claim to be experiencing them, is extremely important. How do we square a subjective experience of self with the claim of naive realism? That was the question that was posed just before the break. If you're saying that McInerney is a realist, and subjective facts are experienced only by the individual, how can they be real? How can we claim them as part of this realist framework? And it all comes down to the trustworthiness of the individual. If they're being honest with you, then there is the case, right? It is the case that there is some pain or some experience. It doesn't have to be pain. You know, if you say that I feel good today, okay, well, that is a fact for you, according to McInerney. It's a subjective fact, so long as you're being trustworthy, so long as you're being honest with yourself. Now, can you have a misrepresentation or misperception of self? Of course, and this is, again, where McInerney and I begin to part ways. I would say that we can be misinformed about ourselves. We can experience something that is not objectively true about ourselves, right? And he probably wouldn't completely disagree, but he's also trying to write a very simple book on logic. This is an introductory text on the idea of logic. So he's not going too deep into philosophy here. He's simply trying to set some ground rules and say there are two ways we can think about facts. One, objective facts. These are items, things that exist in the world, like the pen, the table, the chair, right? You can see them, experience them directly, and you know that they're true. And for McInerney, all of these things exist outside of your human mind. That means if you were unconscious, the world would still exist as it is, according to McInerney. Okay? Objective facts, things, but also events. That certain events have occurred in the past, that they can be evaluated based on the accuracy of the historical evidence. Okay? So objective facts from McInerney are objects and things. Subjective facts depend entirely on the trustworthiness of the person reporting them. If a patient comes to you and they say, "Doc, I'm having some low back pain," that's a fact for McInerney so long as the person is being honest. Yes?
So, what makes sense to me, to what you're saying, is we can think of it as, if I have the thought, I am worthless, I am stupid, I have the thought, and that's a fact, but that is not true.
That's a wonderful question, and it's very much the question that we had during the break about political parties. If someone says that, is it a subjective fact, for instance, how do I frame this? Let me see. If someone is a staunch conservative and the other person here is a staunch progressive, let's say, two polarized ends of the political spectrum, could we say that those two realities, those perceptions of the world are, quote, true for them? Well, they're not true. They're not true in the way that McInerney is describing it. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but we're going to get there. But hear me out just for a second. A subjective fact for McInerney still relates to some sense experience in the world, something that's ontologically real in the world. Like, I am a person in, or not in, but with a body, okay? My lower back exists. I feel pain from that lower back. That's my sense experience. It's subjective because only I can feel it, but it's no less real. But there's something that I can ground that idea in. That is the reality that my low back exists. Does that make sense? When you start to try to ground ideas in things that don't exist concretely in the world, then it gets harder and harder to claim them as facts. So for instance, does conservatism or liberalism exist in the world concretely? No, they're abstract ideas. So McInerney couldn't say, for instance, that those are, quote, facts. It is a fact that someone identifies as a conservative. Okay, that's a fact, because it kind of represents an event. They're identifying themselves that way. But it's a complex idea because conservatism doesn't exist concretely in the world, neither does liberalism or any other political ideology. Does that make sense? If it seems like we're sort of splitting hairs here, what he's trying to show is there's a distance between things in the world or events that occur in the world and our ideas about things. Does that make sense? There's a distance there, and this is what he's trying to parse out. We're going to talk about it a little bit more when we get there, but I'm just trying to put this in your mind. So to sum up, let's get our facts straight. If a given fact is an actually existing thing to which we have access, do I have access to my sense perceptions and my nociceptions in my lower back? Of course I do, right? So that's a fact, even if it's a subjective fact. But if I have access to it, then the surest way to establish its factualness is to put myself in its presence. I can see and experience the table, so I can establish it as a fact. It is a real thing. I can engage with you in this event we call class, and I can establish it as a fact. The further that we get away from sense experience, the less factual it becomes. Does that make sense? A subjective fact to the subject experiencing it is self-evident under normal circumstances. However, through such mechanisms as self-delusion or rationalization, a person could fail to get straight a fact even about himself. Every idea in the mind is ultimately traceable to a thing or things actually existing in a world that is independent of and apart from the mind. Not every philosopher believes this or agrees to this. That's kind of the nature of philosophy. And if you're interested in talking about some alternative ideas, I'd be glad to do it, just not right now. Okay? For the sake of this class, we're going to side with McInerney. We're going to adopt that kind of naive realism that says the world actually exists, it's not constructed in my mind, right? That even if when I'm asleep, the world continues to exist and so forth. Right? An idea is the subjective evocation of an objective fact. That means my ideas, my perceptions, how it appears to me in my mind, is a representation of the actual world. I can trust my ideas. I can trust my senses. Again, that's not universally agreed upon by philosophers, but that's what we're going to adopt for this course. Clear ideas, then, are ideas that faithfully reflect the objective order from which they derive. If I'm seeing the table clearly as it is in the world, then I can claim that as a fact. Does that make sense? If I have a misperception of the table, I can't necessarily count that as a fact. Now, I'm inclined as a philosopher then to say, well, how would we know if our perceptions are accurate? Because all we have are our perceptions. And of course, there are ways of getting around this, but that's going a little deeper than we need to at this moment. Does that make sense? Okay. Everybody okay? All right. Clear ideas and unclear ideas. Clear ideas are ideas that faithfully reflect the objective order. Unclear ideas are those that give us distorted representations of the world. To ensure that our ideas are clear, we must vigilantly attend to the relationship between any given idea and its object. Now, this is extremely important for us as doctors. If a patient presents with a problem, that's a subjective fact, so long as it's an honest accounting of what the patient's experiencing. Does this make sense? Because there's some real association between the patient's idea and the experience, what we call interoception, the information being given to the brain by the body. Does that make sense? We can ground it in something real, that the patient has an actual physical body, and that the interoception, the information gained from it, is being interpreted accurately. That's a big assumption to make, is it not? Could the patient be wrong? Of course. We misperceive ourselves all the time. For the sake of argument, let's take it as fact, right? Now, if I have assessed the patient accurately through a history and a physical exam, then whatever I document in the patient's chart, here I am showing my age. This is my charts in my office with the paper. If I'm accurately documenting it, then what I've done is I've represented a clear idea. Make sense? Now, if I stop attending to and paying attention to the patient, my ideas get less and less and less clear as they deviate from reality. I begin to tell myself stories about the patient that aren't true because I'm not paying attention. I'm not actually observing the patient anymore. Does that make sense? So we have to be vigilant. We have to continuously reflect and observe and refine our thoughts based on our perceptions and our observations. Okay? It's wrong to suppose, and this is where like I'm underlining and bolding this because it just gets to me. It is wrong to suppose that because we know things in the world only through our ideas, it is only our ideas which we really know. This is where I'm really having to give some grace right now to McInerney, because I just don't agree with him. Okay? There are plenty of philosophers throughout history who have taken opposing views to this. What McInerney is saying is very controversial in philosophy. And I keep belaboring the point because it's such an important aspect of this whole class. And here it is. He's saying that, look, you can trust your ideas. If you see a blue and gray carpet on the floor, it's because it's actually there, guys. You don't need to question it.
What color is the dress?
Okay? Yeah, what color is the dress? Is it gold? Is it blue? That's exactly the point, right? There was a famous philosopher in Europe hundreds of years ago. He was a bishop in the church. His name was Berkeley. And what Berkeley was saying is that all we actually have are our ideas. That's it. How do we know that the ideas reflect the world? How do we know that there is even a world outside of our ideas? Absolutely. We mentioned Immanuel Kant, who came a couple of 100 years or so after Berkeley. And Kant was saying that we cannot even know what the world is outside of our mind. He called that the noumena. All that we have access to is the phenomena, the way it appears to us in our mind. Well, Kant is one of the titans of Western philosophy, contrary to McInerney. McInerney is saying, no, cut through all of that. If you see the carpet, what you're seeing is true. We have to kind of go there. Why would I make such a philosophical leap? Because the point of this class is logic and reasoning and epistemology. I'm simply pausing right now to show you that this is not a universally agreed upon idea. Does that make sense? There's lots of different ways to approach this. But he goes further. He says, our ideas are the means, not the ends of our knowledge. They link us to the world. If they are clear ideas, then the links are strong. The most efficient way to clarify our ideas is to look through them to the objects they represent. Now, if you're paying attention, I hope you are, there's a circular begging the question here. He's saying that our ideas are clear insofar as they represent reality. And we only can represent reality through our ideas. It becomes a circular argument. And this is how I would undermine McInerney's claim. But we're not going to do that here. We're going to take it at face value and say, of course, the idea I have on the table is clear. It's true. Okay. Conception is possible, he says, in the thinking subject only because of the subject's encounter with the world. Every time that I encounter the world, I am affirmed in my belief. I'm affirmed in my experience and perception of it. You know, it is the case, guys, that every time I see the carpet, it kind of looks the same. Well, there's something to that, according to McInerney. If my perceptions were grossly off, then they would perhaps change, and I wouldn't get a clear understanding of the nature of the carpet. But every time that I see it, it looks about the same. Well, then that tells me that my ideas about it are accurate. Okay, does it? Well, according to McInerney, it does. How can we know anything about the world? Well, we have to engage with the world. We have to live in the world and experience it directly. That's what he's saying. Our ideas are clear, and understanding of them is clear only to the extent that we keep constant tabs on the things to which they refer. Go back to the patient in your office. If they come in and they say, I got low back pain, and you're doing the history and the physical, the moment that you stop paying attention and you start telling yourself stories about it, and you stop relating the idea you have about it to the actual patient, the further and further you get from the truth. This is what he's saying. And that's good advice for us. We have to continue to be vigilant. We have to constantly weigh and assess the value or the truthfulness of our ideas against the real world. The more we focus on our ideas in a way that systematically ignores their objective origins, the more unreliable those ideas become. It's kind of like this. Patient presents with, we were just having a conversation about some rather traumatic instances with patient care. Patient presents with low back pain, very benign, low risk, typical bread and butter chiropractic. Okay? So the patient comes in, we do a case history, we do a physical exam, and then we determine for ourselves that the patient has discogenic low back pain, with a hot disc. No big deal. Okay? So we tell ourselves that the patient has a hot disc. And then we stop talking to the patient. And we stop doing any further tests. Okay? And then we just start carrying on with care. And a few weeks go by and the patient's no better. Why? Because our ideas have become more unreliable. We have systematically ignored the facts. Does that make sense? The importance here is clear. No matter what your idea of something is, you have to continually evaluate that against reality. Okay?
And that then goes back into experience, right?
It goes back to experience.
So doesn't that mean you have to just keep the adjusted kind of homeostasis?
You have, that's a great example of homeostasis. Just like the body continues to adapt to its surroundings, the mind has to continue to adapt to its experiences, to its perceptions. Okay? If I make an assumption about somebody, I could be accurate, but I could be inaccurate. I have to continuously engage with that person to refine my ideas, to maintain accuracy. Does that make sense? How well do you know somebody? My buddy Danny lives in Midtown. Okay? I've known him since the 7th grade. Well, do you know Danny? Of course I know him. He's one of my best friends. Okay, well, when was the last time you talked to him? It's been a few weeks. Okay, well, how well do you know him? You get what I'm asking? The further and further and further away I get from talking to him, the less I really know him. Does that make sense? I have to continue to maintain a relationship with the world if I claim to know the world. Same thing is true with people. When we speak of establishing a fact, we do not refer to establishing the existence of an idea in the mind. Your thought about something is fine, so long as it aligns with reality. I establish a fact if I successfully ascertain that there is, for a particular idea, a corresponding reality external in my mind, or to my mind, rather. There are three basic components to human knowledge: an objective fact, the idea of the fact, and the word that we apply to it. The example that McInerney gives is a cat, okay? So let's use something else. I'm going to use this backpack that's on the floor. It's a nice bag.
What is it?
Okay? Now there are three components here that we have to have if we're going to claim this as a fact. First of all, there actually has to be a bag here on the floor. Okay? If it's a figment of my imagination, it doesn't count as fact. Then there has to be the idea of it in my mind. I have to perceive it through my sight, maybe through my touch. Okay? So there is a bag, and then I perceive it, and then there has to be a word that I give to it. If I can't articulate what the thing is, then I can't claim it as knowledge. It can't be a fact for me. Does that make sense? It would be like experiencing something like an apparition or a ghost or something, whatever you want to call it. Something for which there are no words. I had this incredible experience. Well, what was it? I can't tell you. I've never seen it before. I don't know what it was I was experiencing. Well, how can you claim it as a fact? There has to be a word that we can apply to it, for it to make sense to us, for it to be a fact for us. Okay? This is what McInerney is claiming. So if this is the case, if you have an actual object in the world like a bag, and then you have a sense perception of it in your mind, an idea, and then you can attach a word to that idea, you're good. You have a clear idea. That's a fact. If that's the case, then how, he asks, are bad ideas possible? Well, this comes down to simple versus complex ideas, and it gets to the question that we were discussing about political affiliation earlier. Okay? Simple and complex ideas. We will call complex ideas those for which there is no simple one-to-one correspondence between the idea and the thing, like democracy. Where does democracy exist? Concretely in the world. Nowhere. There's no place that I can go. It's not like I can take a tour of Washington, D.C. and go to the Smithsonian Museum, and there's a special exhibit there where encased in glass is democracy. It doesn't exist, except in the mind of human beings. But it's something that is important to us, that guides our human behavior and keeps our social structure organized, right? It's very important. Love is one of those ideas. Justice is an idea. Morality and ethics are ideas like this, right? They don't exist in any concrete place, and yet they're essential to how we understand ourselves in the world. These are complex ideas. But what McInerney is saying is that the further we get from actual objects in the world, the more open we are to being wrong, the more open we are to error. Okay? No idea, even the most bizarre, can completely sever its ties with the objective world. If you were trying to come up with something that was completely nonsensical, let me give a funny example. When my daughters were small, they used to watch My Little Pony. And it was like this cartoon reinterpretation of the 1980s My Little Pony show. Okay? And on the show, I remember they came up with this completely fictitious monster character called Discord. And it seemed to be a kind of chimera, where they put together parts of all these different animals into this fictitious figure. It was obvious to me that the animators and the writers of the show were trying to create a nonsensical, fictitious character. You guys with me? But even in doing that, they had to draw upon things that actually exist in the world. There's no completely fabricated, random thing that you could come up with that didn't have its origin in something you've already experienced. Like right now, if I challenged you, come up with, in your mind, picture in your mind, an animal that's never existed before. Crazy. A unicorn. Well, if you do that, aren't you already drawing upon your experience of horses and other horned animals? Yeah, of course you are. What you're doing is you're taking something that you know exists and you're putting it together in novel ways. So no matter how absurd or original an idea you come up with, it's always going to draw upon something that you've experienced in the world. Does that make sense? Schemas is a good way to think about it, right?
I was actually thinking of Carl Jung's psychosocial development that you're talking about.
That's brilliant. So the question is about Carl Jung. Jung had a theory of archetypes, and these, and I don't want to get too far into Jungian psychology, but basically it's these kinds of transcendental ideas that manifest themselves in different ways throughout our lives. Again, I don't want to get too into it, but it's kind of like, it's a very Platonic idea when we go back to the first quarter. What McInerney is trying to say is that there's nothing that you can come up with, even a lie. If you were to come up with something completely fictitious, something that never existed, you would still have to draw upon something from your experience, something that actually exists in the world. Okay? And it does kind of touch on Jungian archetypes. Bad ideas can be informative, not about the objective world, because they cease to faithfully reflect it, but about the subjective state of the person who nourishes the idea. So, if someone were to tell you a lie, does the lie say anything about the world? No, because it doesn't reflect the world anymore. But it does tell you something useful about the liar. Okay? That is useful. Okay. We need to match words to ideas. Like I said about the bag earlier, there are three things that we need to claim that it's a fact. There has to actually be a bag on the floor. If I'm imagining it, it's not a fact. I can see it, and it is the case that there's actually a bag there, and I can put a word to it. And this is what McInerney is stressing here. Ideas as such are not communicable from one mind to another. I cannot take my perception of the bag and download it into your mind. I don't know if Elon Musk is working on that right now. Maybe that's part of Neuralink, I don't know. Please don't do that to me if that ever does happen. I don't need other people's ideas downloaded. I got enough of my own. Okay? But I can't do that yet, right? I can't take my perceptions raw from my brain and download them into your mind. That'd speed up education a lot, wouldn't it? We have to communicate them through ideas. How do we ensure that our words are adequate to the ideas they seek to convey? Does the word bag capture everything that there is to this object? Clearly not. It just gives you a very kind of archetypal, to borrow again that Jungian phrase, sense of what we're referring to. I could also call this a bag, right? But they're very different. They're different in color, different in size, different in weight, probably, shape, yeah? There are all kinds of characteristics between the two bags that make them different. And yet I can apply the same word to them with some degree of utility. That means it's some usefulness. If I say bag, then you kind of have a general sense of what I'm referring to, right? But our words are inadequate, and this is what McInerney is trying to convey. The process is essentially the same as the one we follow when confirming the clarity and soundness of ideas. We must go back to the source of the idea. If I say that this is a bag, the only way that we can make sense of it is if we add to it some of its unique characteristics. And we can only do that through the use of our language, the mastery of our language. The more command you have of your language, the more you can accurately and faithfully communicate ideas. And those ideas then can be attached to the world and do some work for you, okay? Language is essential here. Often we can't come up with the right words for an idea because we don't have a firm grasp on the idea itself. There are two potential problems. Number one is, I may not have a good idea of that bag, right? I can sort of see it, it's a little bit dark in the room. Maybe if I turn the lights up and I really examine it closely, then I can have a clear idea and communicate it to you, right? Same thing is true of a patient. If a patient comes in, all I can do is see them. I can inspect them. Maybe I can palpate and do some other physical exam findings, but that's as close as I can get to the patient. I can't get inside their head to know how they feel, right? But there's another problem to this, which is the limitations of my language. I cannot communicate something for which I have no words. That's a huge problem. Made worse when my language is lacking. In terms of percentage, how much of the English language do you think that we use on a regular basis? It's something close to that. Way less than 10% of the entire English language do we ever use on a regular basis. We're extremely limited. That puts us at a great disadvantage because now we cease to be able to convey facts about the world. Language and logic are inextricably bound together with each other. Okay? Matching words to ideas is the first and most basic step in communication. We want to make sure that what we're describing is accurate to the world. Words have been called the building blocks of language, but it is the statement that logic starts with. For it's only at the level of the statement that the question of truth and falsity is introduced. We first have to make a statement about a thing. If I were to make the statement, for instance, that the bag is on the floor, well, I've used the word bag to describe an object and floor to describe a separate object. And the whole sentence describes a kind of event, the bag being on the floor. And everyone's listening to me like bored to death. This is a simple example. I get it, all right? But what if the statement were something like, the patient has discogenic sciatic radiculopathy? Okay? Now that's describing certain objects in relation to each other and representing an event. But is it capturing the truth of what's happening? Our diagnoses are statements that we make about reality. They are factual only insofar as they reflect the actual case of things, what's happening in the world. They're always generalizations from reality because we can never fully grasp with the meagerness, the limitations of our language, the reality of the world. Is there an ultimate language? That's a good question. I'm afraid it outstrips what we're talking about here. But I do believe that, you guys, did anyone ever take calculus in high school or college? Anybody? Do you guys remember the idea of the limit? I think that there's a limit function to language, right? Language itself can approximate reality, but it can never capture it entirely. There are always going to be aspects of reality that evade, that outstrip our language. Effective communication requires that we use language appropriately, okay? Don't assume that your audience understands the meaning of your words. You got to make it explicit, okay? When you guys are giving health talks to your community or talking to your patients, you're going to have to get out of the habit of using Latin and Greek. When I started in practice, I thought, I know, I'm going to impress my patients by using a lot of fancy doctor talk. Since I already look young anyway and have this ponytail, I'm going to show them how much I know, and they're going to trust me even more. This is going to work. It's going to be great. I'm practicing in rural Alabama. As soon as I started doing a report of findings, laying down on this Latin and Greek, I'm looking at the patient's face, and it's like this. And then the reply comes, what you talking about, Dr. Thornhill? And I'm like, okay. Your tailbone is twisted. Out of place. Oh, well, why didn't you say so? I did. It's okay. You're going to have to get out of calling this the clavicle. This becomes the collarbone. The sacrum goes back to being the tailbone, and so forth. Okay? You have to be able to speak to your audience effectively. Don't assume that they know what you mean. Speak in complete sentences. That sounds obvious, and yet we fall out of the habit of doing this all the time. In fact, I'm sure that you guys know a lot of people who speak in text language. If they were a way to speak in emojis, I'm pretty sure that people under the age of about 12 would do that already. Okay? Speak in complete sentences. Don't treat evaluative statements as if they were statements of subjective fact. If you evaluate something, this gets back to what we talked about progressives and conservatives. If you make a judgment or an evaluation of something, that's not a fact. It is a fact that you've done it, because that's an event, but your opinion doesn't count as fact. This gets to the whole question about truth. If someone says my truth or your truth, no. Our opinion does not count as the big T truth. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but nobody is entitled to their own facts. Does that make sense? According to McInerney and to other realists, there is something that is the case, some objective reality, some real truth to things. Our opinion about them doesn't necessarily count as the truth. Okay? Avoid double negatives. Stevenson commits this error. In fact, principle number 6 of the 33 principles states, there are no, I think he says something like, there are no occurrences that don't require time. There's some double negative like this, when he should have said, everything happens in time. Avoid double negatives if you can. Also, gear your language to your audience. Make sure that they understand you. The word vague comes from the Latin adjective vagus, which means wandering, just like the vagus nerve is the wanderer. And it does. It goes from the brainstem, it travels all the way down through the mediastinum and the thorax, all the way down to the abdomen in the upper part of the gut. when we are vague in our language, we wander. We have to be very straightforward. Don't be ambiguous. Connect your ideas to the world. A word is vague if its referent is blurred. Okay, if I say bag, well, what am I talking about? That's vague. If we're all in this room together and I say, hey guys, this is the thing about it, we're here next week, we're talking, and I'm like, look guys, last week somebody left their bag on the floor. Well, that's not clear. How many bags are on the floor right now? At least 50 or more. Which bag are you talking about? This is what it means to be ambiguous, to be vague. Be clear in your presentation. Satchel. Avoid equivocation. And this is something to write down too, because this is a logic fallacy that we're going to talk about later. Equivocation is when the same word could be used in two different senses. So you're confusing things by the misappropriation of a word. Okay? We'll give you some examples when we go. When we get there. But equivocating is when a word could mean two things, and you're using it in two different ways. Okay? That's equivocation. Don't do that. You have to clearly indicate the meaning. All right. When we get back together next week, we're going to pick up here with evasive language. And please, please, please,